In the quiet of an ordinary morning, Anna observed the smoke from her coffee rising in precise spirals, forming patterns that seemed to want to tell her a story. As a data scientist, her mind was trained to find order in chaos, meaning in numbers, predictability in seemingly random sequences. But what happened when the patterns began to find her? The office where she worked was a temple of logic. Screens displayed graphs, statistical analyses, and projections that allowed for predicting behaviors and trends with admirable precision. For years, this had been her world, a universe governed by algorithms, where each effect had a clear and measurable cause. However, it was precisely there, in the heart of this sanctuary of rationality, that the first cracks began to appear. It started with the number 1111. It appeared in timestamps of important emails, in protocol numbers of crucial projects, in addresses of significant clients. At first, it was easy to dismiss as confirmation bias, that human tendency to pay more attention to patterns that confirm our expectations. Anna knew well the tricks the mind can play, the spurious correlations that can arise when we search too hard for something. The philosopher Carl Jung, in his studies on synchronicity, had already warned about the difference between coincidence and meaning. He proposed that seemingly coincidental events could be connected not by causality, but by meaning. It was an idea that Anna had always considered interesting from a theoretical point of view, but hardly applicable to the real world. Until the patterns began to multiply. They were small details at first, a colleague mentioning exactly the book she had dreamed about the night before, an email arriving at the precise moment she was thinking about an old project, a call from a client asking the question she had just formulated in her mind. Individually, each event could be explained by statistical probability, but together, they began to form a web of connections that defied her rational understanding. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, in his studies on the relationship between emotion and reason, demonstrated that our ability to make decisions depends not only on logic, but also on an intricate system of bodily signals and intuitions that he called somatic markers. It was as if the body had its own form of knowledge, a wisdom that preceded rational thought. In her sleepless nights, Anna began to question the foundations of her worldview. Quantum physics had already demonstrated that, at the most fundamental level of reality, the certainties of classical physics dissolved into a field of probabilities and non-local connections. The very act of observation influenced the behavior of particles. If this was true in the microscopic world, what other levels of reality escaped our everyday perception? The writer Aldous Huxley, in The Doors of Perception, suggested that our normal consciousness functioned as a filter, reducing a vast field of possibilities to a narrow band of experience that allowed us to function in daily life. But what if these patterns, these coincidences, were small cracks in that filter, glimpses of a vaster and more interconnected reality? As these questions accumulated, Anna realized she was facing a choice. She could continue ignoring the signs, taking refuge in the safety of her rational explanations. Or she could do something that, as a scientist, she had learned to value. Observe the phenomenon with an open mind, collect data, seek deeper patterns. Perhaps true rationality wasn't in denying the inexplicable, but in being willing to expand the limits of what we consider possible. That's how she began to keep a journal, not just of numbers and coincidences, but also of sensations, dreams, intuitions that seemed to come from a deeper source than her conscious thought. Like a scientist in unknown territory, she was about to embark on a journey of discovery that would challenge everything she believed she knew about the nature of reality. Anna's first great discovery came through the body. As someone accustomed to living in the mind, she had always treated her physical sensations as something secondary, mere biological signals to be managed to keep the machine running. But now, something had changed. Her body seemed to be communicating in its own language, subtle and precise. It was as if each cell had become an ultra-sensitive antenna, picking up information that her rational mind couldn't process, a tightness in her stomach before an apparently routine meeting that would prove crucial, an inexplicable lightness in her chest moments before receiving transformative news, dire tension in the back of her neck, alerting her to people or situations that deserved more attention. The doctor and researcher Candace Pert, in her revolutionary studies on the biology of emotions, discovered that neuropeptide receptors, the molecules of emotion, are not only in the brain but distributed throughout the body. Each emotion, each thought, each intuition had a biochemical correspondence that affected every cell. The body was not just a vehicle for the mind, but an integrated system of knowledge and perception. Anna began to dedicate time to simply feeling. In the first attempts, it was difficult to distinguish between anxiety and intuition, between fear and legitimate caution. But gradually, like someone learning a new language, she began to recognize the different tones and nuances of these bodily messages. The integrative physician Gabor Mate spoke about how the body holds memories and wisdom that the conscious mind often doesn't access, and how chronic stress can disconnect us from this innate intelligence. In her research, she found studies about the heart's brain, a complex network of neurons that operates with relative independence from the central brain. The HeartMath Institute had documented how the heart emits an electromagnetic field much more powerful than that of the brain, capable of influencing not only our own organism, but also the people around us. One day, during an important presentation, Anna had an experience that would change her understanding forever. In the middle of her well-rehearsed speech, she felt an inexplicable impulse to deviate from the script. Her entire body seemed to vibrate, with a certainty that came from a place beyond reason. Following this impulse, she shared a completely new perspective on the project. The result was a series of insights that transformed not only that presentation, but the entire course of the work. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty said that our perception of the world is not just mental but fundamentally bodily. We don't just think the world, but inhabit it with our entire being. Anna was beginning to understand this not as theory, but as lived experience. Every shiver, every change in heart rate, every sensation of expansion or contraction was part of an ongoing dialogue with a vaster reality. At night, she began to practice a simple but profound exercise. Before sleeping, she reviewed her day, paying attention not to the events themselves, but to the bodily sensations that accompanied them. She began to notice surprising patterns. Decisions that had turned out right were often preceded by a specific sensation of expansion in the chest. Situations that ended up proving problematic were accompanied by a contraction in the solar plexus region that, at the time, she had ignored. The psychologist Eugene Gendlin, creator of the focusing method, described how the body carries an implicit knowledge of situations that precedes our conceptual understanding. He called this a felt sense, a felt sensation that, when properly attended to, could reveal deep insights about our situation. Anna was learning to access this embodied wisdom, but the most surprising thing was how this new form of perception was affecting her relationships. In meetings, she found herself picking up on subtexts and dynamics that had previously gone unnoticed. Her interactions became more fluid, more attuned. It was as if her body was in constant dialogue, not only with her own inner wisdom, but with a broader field of information and meaning. It was in the midst of a particularly intense anxiety crisis that Anna discovered the power of silence. After an especially turbulent week at work, where patterns and synchronicities seemed to multiply at a dizzying speed, her mind was in a state of constant agitation. Each new sign seemed to demand interpretation, each coincidence demanded analysis. It was as if her brain had transformed into a perpetual processing machine, trying to find meaning in an endless flow of information. It was at this moment that she remembered something she had read about meditation in her research. The neuroscientist Francisco Varela talked about how contemplative practice could create a space between stimulus and response, a vital pause that allowed a different form of knowledge to emerge, not by accumulation of information, but by a process of clarification and quieting. Her first attempts at meditating were frustrating. Sitting in her favorite armchair, trying to focus on her breath, her mind seemed more active than ever. Thoughts about work, about the patterns she was observing, about her doubts and fears came in cascades. The philosopher Alan Watts compared the mind to an agitated monkey, jumping from branch to branch without ever finding rest. Anna understood this metaphor perfectly now, but there was something different about these sessions. Even amid the mental agitation, she began to notice small moments of clarity, microseconds of silence between thoughts. It was as if, for the first time, she was witnessing the functioning of her own mind from a slightly detached perspective. She was no longer completely identified with the incessant flow of thoughts. The psychiatrist and researcher Daniel Siegel described this process as mind sight, the ability to observe the functioning of one's own mind without being completely absorbed by it. It was a skill that could be cultivated, just as we strengthen a muscle through regular exercise. Anna began to dedicate 15 minutes every morning to this practice. Gradually, something began to change. The moments of silence between thoughts began to expand. It was as if she was discovering a new territory within herself, a space of clarity and quietude that had always been there, just waiting to be noticed. The mystic Eckhart Tolle spoke about this space as the very essence of consciousness, prior to any thought or experience. It was in this space of silence that Anna began to perceive a subtle but significant difference in the nature of the signals she had been receiving. When her mind was agitated, trying to control and interpret everything, the patterns seemed confusing and contradictory. But in moments of quietude, the connections revealed themselves with a natural clarity, effortlessly. The neuroscientist Marcus Raichle had discovered that when we are not actively engaged in mental tasks, a specific neural network, the default mode network, becomes more active. It was as if the brain had a natural contemplative mode, which could only be accessed when we allowed ourselves to let go of conscious control. One morning during her meditation, Anna had an experience that would change her understanding forever. For a moment, all thought ceased, and she found herself immersed in crystal-clear clarity. In this state, she realized that she had been approaching the whole question of signs and synchronicities in the wrong way. It wasn't something to be deciphered by the mind, but to be recognized at a deeper level of consciousness. The psychologist Carl Rogers spoke about how our organism has a natural wisdom that can only express itself when we create the right conditions of acceptance and openness. Anna was learning that silence was one of those essential conditions. It was in the space between thoughts that she could really hear the voice of intuition. This discovery began to influence all aspects of her life. At work, she learned to take regular pauses, creating moments of silence even on the busiest days. In relationships, she developed the ability to really listen, not just to the words, but to the silences between them. And in her quest to understand the patterns that continued to manifest in her life, she learned to trust more in the silent knowledge that emerged naturally than in the elaborate interpretations of her mind. The first sign that something fundamental had changed in her perception came on a seemingly ordinary day. Anna was in a coffee shop, her laptop open displaying spreadsheets and graphs, when a peculiar sensation began to manifest. It was as if she could perceive, almost physically, the invisible connections linking all the people in the environment, the barista preparing coffee with artisanal precision, the student immersed in her books at the next table, the executive talking on the phone near the window. They all seemed to be part of an intricate web of relationships and meanings. It wasn't just her imagination projecting patterns. There was a different quality to this perception, a clarity that came from the silence she had cultivated in her meditations. The physicist David Bohm, in his reflections on the nature of reality, proposed the existence of an implicate order underlying the world of appearances. According to him, the universe was not made of separate parts interacting mechanically, but was an indivisible whole in constant flux. What we perceive as separate objects and events would be merely the surface manifestation of a deeper and interconnected reality. Anna began to notice how seemingly unrelated events intertwined in meaningful ways. A casual comment from a colleague led to an important discovery in a project. A traffic delay resulted in an encounter that opened new possibilities. It was as if life was constantly weaving patterns of meaning, but only now was she developing the senses to perceive them. The biologist Rupert Sheldrake, with his theory of morphogenetic fields, suggested that all systems, be they molecules, organisms, or social groups, are organized by invisible fields of information that extend in space and time. This idea resonated with the experience Anna was having. It was as if she could feel these fields of subtle influence operating in her daily life. One day, during an important meeting, she had a revealing experience. While her colleagues discussed strategies and projections, she began to perceive how each person in the room was connected to a vast network of relationships, experiences, and potentials. It wasn't just a team discussing business. It was a point of convergence where countless lines of possibility met. The anthropologist Gregory Bateson talked about how the mind is not confined to the individual brain, but extends through the entire network of ecological and social relationships. Anna was experiencing this truth directly. Her consciousness seemed to expand to include a broader field of information and meaning. Her professional decisions began to change. Instead of relying solely on data and logical analyses, she began to consider the broader field of connections and possibilities as well. Curiously, this didn't make her decisions less precise. On the contrary, it added a dimension of wisdom that complemented her analytical approach. The psychologist James Hillman suggested that each event in our lives has an archetypal dimension, connecting to universal patterns of meaning. Anna began to see how her own experiences connected to broader themes of human experience. Her struggles and discoveries were not just personal. They were part of a larger pattern of evolution of consciousness. At night, in her journal, she began to map these connections in a new way. They were no longer just records of coincidences, but a living document of how different aspects of reality intertwined and influenced each other mutually. It was as if she was developing a new organ of perception, capable of capturing the subtle currents of meaning that flowed through everyday life. It was during a presentation to the board that Anna faced her first major challenge. She was presenting the results of an important project when a strong intuition led her to suggest a significant change in the company's strategy. Her data pointed in one direction, but something deeper indicated a different path. The silence in the room was deafening. Based on what data do you make this suggestion? The question came sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Anna felt the familiar tightness in her stomach, that sensation she now recognized as an important signal. But how to explain intuitions and synchronicities in a business meeting? How to translate the subtle language of patterns into the vocabulary of graphs and projections? The psychologist William James, in his studies on religious experience, talked about how different states of consciousness give access to different aspects of reality. Anna was experiencing this dilemma firsthand. Her personal experience had expanded to include dimensions that defied conventional explanation, but the world around her still operated mainly through Cartesian logic. At home, her discoveries met similar resistance. Her partner, an engineer, dedicated to precision and logic, listened to her stories with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "You've always been so rational," he commented, as if witnessing the crumbling of something precious. Longtime friends exchanged worried glances when she mentioned her experiences. The neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist, in his work on the brain hemispheres, described how our Western culture had become progressively dominated by the type of attention characteristic of the left hemisphere, focused, analytical, reductionist. The type of knowledge Anna was accessing, more holistic and intuitive, characteristic of the right hemisphere, was often dismissed as less valid or reliable. One night, after a particularly challenging day, Anna had a vivid dream. She was in a laboratory, surrounded by scientific equipment when the walls began to dissolve, revealing a vast field of pulsating energy. In the dream, she perceived with crystal clarity that the measuring instruments and the energy field were not separate realities, but different aspects of the same thing. The quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli, in his collaboration with Carl Jung, had explored how physical reality and psychic reality could be complementary aspects of a deeper reality. Anna was beginning to understand that she didn't need to choose between reason and intuition. The real challenge was to develop a form of knowledge that could honor both. Gradually, she began to develop her own language to navigate between these worlds. Instead of trying to explain her intuitions in purely logical terms, she learned to combine objective data with more subtle observations. She discovered that many people, especially in leadership positions, secretly relied on their own intuitions even if they rarely admitted it openly. The psychologist Claire Graves, in her work on the development of human consciousness, described how new levels of understanding emerge through the integration of apparent opposites. Hannah was living this process of integration. Her scientific training wasn't being denied, but expanded to include other forms of knowledge. In her presentations, she began to include not only quantitative data, but also qualitative analyses that captured more subtle patterns. Surprisingly, her predictions and recommendations became even more accurate. It was as if she had access to a more complete set of information, which included both the measurable and the intangible. A decisive moment came when she was invited to lead an especially complex project. Instead of relying only on traditional methodologies, Anna proposed an approach that integrated data analysis with periods of silent reflection and attention to emerging patterns. To her surprise, the proposal was accepted, albeit with some initial skepticism. The real transformation began when Anna stopped trying to separate her life into compartments. Reason and intuition, science and mystery, data and synchronicities. Everything began to flow together in a complex but harmonious dance. It was as if she was learning a new form of cognition, one that included but transcended linear thinking. The philosopher Ken Wilber talked about the importance of an integral approach to knowledge, one that could honor both the objective truths of science and the subjective and intersubjective dimensions of human experience. Anna was discovering, in practice, what this meant. In her work, she began to notice how the numbers and graphs she analyzed daily were more than abstract representations. They were living symbols that told stories about deeper patterns of reality. The algorithms she developed were no longer just logical sequences, but expressions of a vaster intelligence operating through them. Quantum physics had already demonstrated that the observer cannot be separated from the observed. The very act of observation influences what is being observed. Anna began to perceive how this applied not only at the subatomic level, but in all her experience. Her consciousness was not separate from the patterns she observed, it was an integral part of the process of discovery. One day, during a particularly intense session of data analysis, she had an extraordinary experience. The numbers on the screen began to reveal not just statistical trends, but a deeper pattern of meaning. It was as if she could see through the data to something more fundamental. Not just what the numbers said, but what they meant in the larger context of life. The mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead proposed that reality is not made of static substances, but of interconnected events and processes. Anna was experiencing this truth directly. Each number, each graph, each decision was part of a living process of discovery and creation. Instead of trying to force her intuitions to fit into purely rational models or abandoning her scientific training in favor of a purely intuitive approach, Anna began to develop a way of working that honored both dimensions. It was like a dance between different modes of knowledge, each contributing its own wisdom. The psychologist Roberto Assagioli, founder of psychosynthesis, talked about how different aspects of personality could be integrated into a higher synthesis. Anna was living this process not only internally, but in all dimensions of her life. Reason and intuition were no longer adversaries, but partners in a dance of discovery. In her journal, she began to develop a new type of notation that combined objective data with intuitive observations. It was a personal system that reflected her growing ability to navigate between different levels of reality. Synchronicities were no longer isolated events to be analyzed, but part of an ongoing dialogue with a greater intelligence. One afternoon, during a particularly important meeting, Anna realized she had reached a new level of integration. While presenting complex data analyses, she could simultaneously feel the more subtle currents of energy and meaning flowing through the room. It was no longer a question of choosing between different modes of knowledge, but of allowing all of them to contribute to a richer and more complete understanding of reality. It was on a Sunday afternoon during a family lunch that Anna realized how much she had changed. The conversation flowed as usual, with the usual discussions about work, politics, and the small dramas of everyday life. But something was different. She could feel the undercurrents of emotion, the familiar patterns that had been repeating for generations, the invisible connections that kept everyone united in a complex dance of love, fear, and expectations. The systemic psychologist Bert Hellinger talked about how each family is a field of relationships, where ancestral patterns continue to influence the present. Anna was beginning to see this clearly now. Each gesture, each unspoken word, each recurring conflict was part of a larger web of meanings that extended through time. Her relationship with her partner had transformed in unexpected ways. At first, her new perceptions had created a distance, as if they were speaking different languages. But gradually, something deeper emerged. He began to notice how her crazy intuitions often proved correct, how her seemingly illogical decisions ended up making sense in retrospect. The philosopher Martin Buber described two types of relationship: I-it, where we treat the other as an object of knowledge and use, and I-thou, where we encounter the other in their mysterious totality. Anna was learning to move between these two forms of relationship with growing grace. She could analyze behaviors and patterns objectively when necessary, but she also knew how to dive into a space of pure presence where social masks dissolved. At work, her leadership assumed a different quality. It was no longer just about achieving goals and optimizing processes. She began to see her team as a living organism, each person bringing not just technical skills, but a whole universe of potentials to be discovered. Meetings became spaces of exploration where different forms of knowledge could coexist and enrich each other. In her daily interactions, she developed an increased ability to read people, not just through their words and actions, but through a more subtle understanding of their internal states. It wasn't telepathy or some supernatural power, but a refined attunement to nonverbal signals, energy changes, the subconscious patterns that people emanated. The psychologist Carl Rogers talked about how authentic relationships have an inherent healing power. Anna discovered that the more she allowed herself to be present with total authenticity, the more people in her life felt safe to do the same. It was as if her own inner integration was creating a field that invited others to greater integration. Her friendships also transformed. Some people distanced themselves, uncomfortable with her new way of being. Others, surprisingly, drew closer, as if her openness to mystery had created a space where they too could explore deeper aspects of themselves. New friendships emerged, people who seemed to have been placed in her path by an intelligence greater than her conscious understanding. A particularly significant moment occurred during a difficult conversation with her mother. Years of misunderstanding and unmet expectations seemed to create an invisible barrier between them. But now, with her new ability to perceive deeper patterns, Anna could see beyond the surface conflict. She saw how the fear of the unknown, which had so marked her own journey, was also present in her mother's resistance. Instead of trying to convince or explain, she simply remained present, allowing silence to create a space where a new form of connection could emerge. It was a moment of healing that transcended words, a mutual recognition that went beyond differences in perspective. On the morning of her birthday, Anna woke up with crystal clarity. The room was bathed in the golden light of dawn, and for a moment everything seemed perfectly aligned. The patterns of light on the wall, the rhythm of her breathing, the distant sounds of the city waking up. It was as if her entire being was attuned to a deeper frequency of reality. Reflecting on her journey, she realized she had arrived not at a final destination, but at a new beginning. What had begun as a series of intriguing coincidences had transformed into a complete reimagining of her relationship with reality. The data scientist who sought patterns in numbers had become an explorer of patterns in all dimensions of existence. The physicist David Bohm talked about an implicate order underlying the manifest universe, a dimension where everything is interconnected in an indivisible totality. Anna now understood this not as theory, but as lived experience. The patterns she observed in data, in relationships, in seemingly random events, were manifestations of this deeper order. Her work had transformed into a form of contemplative practice. Each data analysis was an opportunity to perceive how microscopic patterns reflected larger patterns. Each business decision was an exercise in balancing analytical knowledge with intuitive wisdom. Synchronicities were no longer exceptions to the rule, but glimpses of a greater order operating through the seemingly casual circumstances of life. In her journal, she wrote, "Reality is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Each moment is a portal to the infinite, each encounter an opportunity to awaken more deeply to the truth of who we are. The patterns I observe are not just external connections, but reflections of a greater intelligence, operating through everything and everyone." The transpersonal psychologist Stanislav Grof suggested that our psyche is intrinsically connected with the totality of the cosmos. Anna had discovered that this connection was not a philosophical abstraction, but a lived reality that could be cultivated and deepened through conscious attention. Each breath, each thought, each choice was an opportunity to align more deeply with this greater intelligence. Her dreams had become more vivid, more meaningful. They were not just processing of daily memories, but messages from deeper levels of her psyche, sometimes offering precise insights into situations that were yet to come. The boundary between waking and dreaming, between intuition and analysis, between self and other, had become more fluid, more permeable. In her work, she began to subtly implement practices that allowed others to explore different forms of knowledge as well. Meetings began with moments of conscious silence. Important decisions were preceded by time for intuition and deep reflection. The company culture began to change gradually, becoming more integrated, more human. The present, she realized, was the only true portal for this ongoing discovery. Not the present as a fleeting point between past and future, but the present as a vertical dimension of existence where all possibilities are alive and available. Each moment carried the potential for a new understanding, each breath an opportunity to awaken more deeply to the truth of who we are. Anna understood that her journey had no endpoint. It was a perpetual invitation to explore the infinite dimensions of reality, to dance on the frontier between the known and the unknown, to remain open to mystery without losing the rigor of scientific investigation. The patterns and synchronicities that had initiated her search were no longer enigmas to be deciphered, but constant reminders of the interconnected and mysterious nature of existence. And so, on that golden morning, Anna allowed herself to simply be scientist and mystic, analyst and intuitive, individual and universal, knowing that each moment carried the seed of new discoveries, each breath an opportunity to dance more deeply with the infinite mystery of existence.